Hey, well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's lovely to be able to speak to the TAFSIG community. Technically, I've been retired from paid employment since 2015, but when you retire as an academic, you never really retire, which is lovely. So I have a visiting professor in English language assessment role at CRELA, the University of Bedfordshire, which means I'm involved in some research projects, some supervision of postgraduates, mentoring younger colleagues, and sometimes co-authoring research papers with them, or in advising on research projects. I also have a role with Cambridge Assessment English as the consultant series editor for the Studies in Language Testing series, which means that I oversee volumes from manuscript to print. Sometimes I edit them, sometimes I co-author. Previously, I was a full-time faculty member at CRELA, and before that I worked for many years, either full-time or as a consultant for Cambridge. So I've had a long association with Cambridge assessment. And I'm currently president of UCALTA and involved in ILTA as well. So it's a bit of a sort of portfolio existence. So I suppose like many of us, I started out as a modern languages graduate. My languages were Russian and French. And then having done my first degree, I worked for a few years in a translation company. So I became quite interested in that side of sort of commercial language use. And then I trained as a TEFL teacher in 1980 to teach in a couple of English language schools in London. And I did a certain amount of preparation of students for the tests that were around then, which were mainly Cambridge Proficiency and First Certificate, the ARL, speaking and listening tests, and also ELTS in the early 1980s. A little later, I moved closer to Cambridge because of the teaching and working opportunities there for EFL, and I became an FCE examiner for the writing paper. So I suppose that was my first close introduction to working in assessment. And out of that, I was invited over time to join some of the test writing teams for Cambridge on exams such as FCE or the preliminary English test, and gradually just became increasingly involved in projects that they were working on. In 1989, I was invited to join the team that was developing a new Cambridge test called Cambridge Advanced, that's its name now, situated between FCE and CPE, which was regarded as a very high level achievement test and quite difficult for students to reach. So that was launched in 1991. So in terms of my introduction to assessment, I wouldn't say I ever started out with an intention of going into that field, but I experienced a sort of apprenticeship in language testing during the 1980s within the sort of communities of practice paradigm. So by the late 1980s, I was quite keen to pull together a lot of the work that I'd been doing and my understanding, and I enrolled on the new MPhil in applied linguistics with Professor Gillian Brown at Cambridge University, and then did a PhD in the early 1990s there. And both of my dissertations for those qualifications focused on language assessment issues in relation to testing use of English and reading comprehension ability, because that was my working life really. After that, I became involved in IELTS, and I was closely involved in the research and development work for the IELTS revision in 1995 through to about 2005 as chief examiner. And I worked on consultancy projects for Cambridge in different places, mainly helping to develop assessment literacy among language specialists and test development teams in China and the Baltic states and a few other places too. So that's my apprenticeship in language testing. It's probably true to say that I started out much more in reading and use of English, but became more closely involved with speaking assessment through the Cambridge Advanced Development Project in the late 1980s, because we were trying to be quite innovative in our development of that particular new examination in English, and trying to apply some of the communicative language testing principles and practice that were very much part of that era. So that meant having the flexibility to think about introducing, for example, a paired format as mandatory rather than optional. It's not the first paired format that Cambridge had worked with, but it was the first time that the paired format, in other words, 2 candidates, was introduced for all candidates rather than as an option. We also introduced 2 examiners, believing that it would be good to have an opportunity for more interactive conversation. We could have multiple tasks eliciting different types of talk and interaction. And having been involved in that, I suppose my interest in and focus on speaking assessment continued through the revision and redevelopment work for IELTS in 1995 and beyond. As you and your colleagues know, IELTS has long been used in higher education and in professional domains, and one of its USPs, I think, has been that it's had a face-to-face speaking test. So when various other components of IELTS were revised in 1995, we had to think very carefully about what to do with the 15-minute or so face-to-face speaking test one-on-one. There was still quite a lot of research that was still in progress and hadn't been concluded. So we didn't revise the speaking test in 1995. We waited until 2001 to do that. And a lot of my work during that period was focusing on how do we reconfigure, if that was the right thing to do, the IELTS speaking test. How do we retrain a worldwide cadre of face-to-face examiners, which is not straightforward? And how do we develop a speaking test which is fit for purpose with appropriate rating scales to the highest level of quality that was possible? So that sort of period of time was very much focused on speaking assessment issues for me. And in 1999, Cambridge then invited me to move from a consultancy position to set up a new unit within the research and validation group, focusing specifically on performance testing. It was called the Performance Testing Unit, and it oversaw the quality assurance, the test validation, and the research agenda for all the Cambridge speaking and writing tests. So that was quite a big portfolio. And that then led on in time to a role as assistant director in the research and validation group, which I stayed in till 27, and then returned to a freelance consultancy role. And I've continued to maintain an interest in speaking assessment, design, development, training of examiners, raters, and I suppose maintained that interest throughout in different contexts. So I've worked with both Crella and Cambridge in recent years to help with test development and research projects. And I suppose one extra thing might be to say that I've always had a strong interest in qualitative research methodology, and discourse analysis, conversation analysis are rich tools to explore spoken language production, especially talk in interaction, whatever the context, but including testing. That's quite a challenging question, actually. In a sense, they're the same as speaking assessment in any context. But as I thought about this, I went back to the work by Cyril Weir. Cyril's lifelong work, and he was a close colleague and a friend, was on the construct of academic literacy. His specialism really was reading, but he had an interest in what academic literacy is as a whole. And he helpfully identified, I think, particularly in the last period of his life, 3 possible paradigms, which, if you like, are lenses through which we can examine the demands of the EAP context for students and for their lecturers. So I'm going to use that as a sort of a way of explaining how I think we can look at this question about what are the key issues in relation to speaking assessment in an EAP context. The first paradigm that he talked about was the concept of a generic study skills approach, and this draws very heavily on the work of Alan Davis, where I suppose the generic approach is that you don't focus on a specific domain, disciplinary domain, and all that is relevant is generic English language study skills which would serve the student well in any course, in any context. It's the most generalist, I suppose. The second paradigm that Cyril highlighted, drawing on work in the field, was the genre-specific approach, which is much more discipline and genre-driven. It draws on work from discourse analysis and corpus linguistics to identify that different disciplinary traditions and fields have their own way of reading, writing, speaking and listening. And this is something that students need to be inducted in, if you like, if they're going to be successful in their academic study. And it's to some extent, it's a blending of the more generic study skills with the more context-specific, disciplinary, genre-driven approach. The third paradigm that I think Cyril identified was what could be called the socially situated approach. And in this approach, what becomes as important as generic study skills or discipline-specific skills is the notion of the student's identity, the notion of the institutional culture which they are coming to inhabit, the notion of power and authority dynamics. And my colleagues from the critical linguistics and critical language testing linguistics tradition would perhaps prioritize these things. The student in higher education is learning to be a member of that community and therefore needs to learn certain things about how that community works culturally, socially, in terms of power dynamics, etc. So in the English for academic purposes context, the question arises, well, which approach is going to be the most useful to help us in our designing of speaking assessments, or are elements of all three of these paradigms relevant and useful? And I suppose my argument would be that language test designers have a responsibility to think very carefully about all three paradigms and to take account of these in their assessment design, particularly the importance of audience and purpose and context. So there's no one size fits all for EAP students. Much as it might be convenient to have that, it does require quite a bit of thinking and working to identify, what the key issues are. And I think in relation to speaking, as for any other skill, the role of needs analysis still remains very important. What do international students, and actually maybe home students as well, need to be able to do in terms of speaking, spoken language production, at what point in their studies and why? And I think reflecting on this period of our history, I would say we're living through a huge shift in the sorts of speaking and listening skills university students need to have in order to be successful in their studies, as so many courses move online into a virtual and a very different teaching, learning and socializing environment. And it's going to be interesting for me to see how that might lead to some re-evaluation and even a redefinition of the speaking and listening construct for higher education. To some degree, I think that's already happened for reading and writing, because much reading and writing has moved into an online environment over the past decade. And that's already reflected in some approaches to reading and writing assessment. But I wonder if speaking and listening assessment has some catching up to do, and the rate of progress is going to be accelerated due to the demands forced upon us by the current pandemic, as is true for so many areas of our society and our current life, whether it's education or medicine or transportation. So I don't know if that's a sort of a helpful answer, but it's an answer that reflects the complexity of this area, and you know, what issues are going to be important going forward, as well as what issues have been important up to now. This follows on naturally, really, from what I've been saying. And as I've said, we're in a time of transition, so the nature of HE delivery is changing. The nature of student experience is changing. There are lots of unknowns, but we can at least sort of watch carefully and read the signs and try and be creative in our responses. And I think there's already been quite a lot of self-reflection and debate over recent months in this area, as assessment providers and assessment users share their thoughts and experience of the changing landscape for teaching and learning and assessment. What will the future look like post-COVID in relation to the sort of areas that you've identified? Or will that time ever come? Or do we need to adapt to some sort of new normality? And I think my view would be that we continue to draw on general principles that have always been true and still stand us in good stead. What is reasonable, what is realistic, and why? What is needed and why? And perhaps a more generic study skills approach is important for pre-sessionals, maybe in-sessionals, maybe also prior to university entry as well. But where EAP support is being provided once somebody is on their way within the courses that they've chosen for university, maybe a more genre-specific approach post-entry is important, perhaps as they become increasingly familiar with the genres and modes of discourse within a disciplinary field. That might be a greater focus. And beyond that, an increasingly socially situated approach as the student socialises and begins to inhabit their chosen discipline for the future, as they begin to acquire, if you like, an academic identity within an academic community or a subsection of that community. But certainly in terms of testing speaking assessment proficiency for university entry, I would err towards the generic end, because it's not always clear what students are going to move into later on. And I think investing time and energy in a more genre-driven or genre-specific approach is possibly not the wisest use of resources. Having said that, it's valuable to enable students to be aware of genres, though I think maybe that may be more relevant in the reading and writing skills perhaps than in the speaking and listening skills. I mean, interaction in speaking assessment has actually always been important, and if you went back to look at Cambridge Proficiency in 1913, you will find an interactional component there. But it hasn't always been easy to either define or measure or report meaningful scores when you compare it with other measurement foci like lexical range or grammatical accuracy or pronunciation. I think, however the interaction is being assessed, should ideally involve some element of talking interaction in the test design that would involve more than one person, perhaps more than two, multiple task types, not just a single conversation, task types which provide opportunities to take differing roles within that interactional management. That will require a certain length of time. It would be lovely to have an interactional test that was more than half an hour long. That's rarely possible, except perhaps in highly specific professional domain testing like medicine. The test design needs to be well matched to the level of the students, not requiring them to do something which isn't challenging enough or which is too challenging, so that the sample of language you get is not one that you can make a valid assessment on. And it needs to be well matched to the purpose. And all of that means you need to know, as the test designer, you need to know your intended context, your intended purpose, and your intended candidature as well as you possibly can. I think it's also true to say that, the construct of interactional competence that we've been working with over the last few decades has been greatly expanded recently to include and define more precisely aspects such as topic management, turn management, breakdown repair, and even interactive listening. And it may be interesting to some of our listeners today that there's a 2018 paper that I co-wrote with Evelina Galaczi in Language Assessment Quarterly, which talks about defining and operationalising interactional competence and some of these areas. From an assessment point of view, there's always a challenge that some of these aspects may not scale very well, or raters may not be able to differentiate levels of competence. So it's not true to say that everything can fit on a 5-point scale. It doesn't always work as conveniently as that. And although it's good to have a sophisticated understanding of the interactional competence construct, the more complex we make it, the more difficult it can be to know how best to test it. It becomes difficult to know how to weight the relative importance of some features against other features and how to report meaningful and useful scores. So it's probably true to say that it's difficult to design a test that will do everything, that will focus on all of these aspects. Then it becomes important to identify which are the features of interactional competence that are important for this particular group, in this particular context, and for whatever purpose you want to use the test scores. I think the other big challenge with testing interaction is the nature of co-constructed discourse. When people talk in interaction, they are generally collaborating and both contributing to the spoken language outcome. And there has been some discussion in the literature about how do you award fair and meaningful scores for co-constructed talk. So that's another challenge. And I'm giving you more of the challenges perhaps than more the answers, but I think the answers are very much for individual testers and test designers to think through and come to a mind on. There are other things like non-linguistic and paralinguistic features, eye contact, gaze, posture, laughter, facial expressions. All of these are part of interactional competence. But whether we test them or not is open to debate. This is such a minefield, isn't it? And again, my answer in some respects is, well, it all depends. I think the issue of cultural norms when assessing oral interaction is a very tricky one, a very sensitive one. And I'm cautious about using emotive terms such as colonising the performance of speaking, I suppose because it carries with it a sort of negative intentionality that may not be helpful in a discussion of what constitutes interactional competence, especially in international communication contexts nowadays. I think if I were to take a step back, I would say, well, the field of applied linguistics over the past 50 to 75 years has demonstrated quite clearly there's always a risk that one way of speaking can assume or acquire a level of perceived or real dominance over another, whether it's in terms of the way we pronounce the words or the lexis that is chosen or the grammatical structures that people use and so on. And this is a reality. We know that. We also know that applied linguistics has been able to uncover and reveal for us the variety, the diversity of norms, which may be to do with different regions or countries, or to do with age or gender, etc. In relation to speaking, and I think this is true for any other skill, the importance of needs analysis is what we come back to. What do international and maybe also home students need to be able to do? What is important in terms of their competence to interact in an international education context? What constitutes a good or acceptable or a desirable standard? And we also know that standards and norms can evolve and change over time, so that what was once considered the right way, RP or Queen's English or whatever, or best way to say something, has given way to a new norm that reflects our changing world in international communication. And happily, we're becoming more exposed to previously unfamiliar varieties of language, whether our own or someone else's, and these are being recognised and reflected in teaching materials and also in testing. So by way of illustration, for language testing, the traditional native speaker standard has almost dropped out of existence. It's given way to a view that accentedness is actually the norm in language use, and it's not necessarily a deficit position. So standard British or standard American English has slowly given way to a broader view that embraces other varieties of spoken English, and the value of localization and localized diversity is becoming more recognized. Having said that, the understanding and embracing of linguistic and communicative diversity has got to be balanced with notions of what is internationally or globally accessible. Everybody can share in it. People are not excluded by virtue of the way they use or don't use language. So these two, the sort of globalization and the localization, are always in some degree of tension and open to debate in terms of what standards and language norms should be taught or tested in any given context. And I think it's true to say our understanding and appreciation of what constitutes good and effective communication in international contexts is constantly evolving and growing, whether we're talking about diplomats at the United Nations interacting together, or the international teaching and learning communities in our UK universities nowadays. So for me, the key issue becomes not what are the best or right norms against which to judge somebody's spoken performance, but rather what are the most appropriate norms, taking into account the context that the test scores will be used in, the purpose for which the test is designed, and the people it's designed for. And often that's going to have to be a collaborated, negotiated decision among EAP lecturers, test designers, etc. It means it's going to be quite hard work, because norms or standards concerning intelligibility or interactional or mediational skills are going to have to be carefully negotiated to match appropriately with a given assessment context or purpose, rather than appealing to a sort of one-size-fits-all set of standards. It requires more hard work on the part of test developers. I know that from my own experience at the construct definition and operationalization stage. But it's actually more intelligent and a fine-tuned approach, and it avoids the temptation to be lazy in test design and with potentially negative outcomes for anyone involved. To some things that I think are going to change, and I have no idea how they are going to change, but I suspect that change is here to stay. But there are a couple of things that I thought I would highlight. One is the continuing advances in technology, and these were happening before this year, and the potential for advanced technology to expand our ability to assess spoken language competence in a variety of ways, and perhaps focus on a variety of types of interaction. Traditionally, there used to be a sort of an old opposition between face-to-face testing, two people in the same room, same physical geographical space, and semi-direct testing, which usually involved a piece of technology like a tape recorder, where you can only have one person speaking. Interaction is very difficult because actually the prompts are on a cassette or some sort of technological platform. And the opposition between those was, well, face-to-face allows you to have reciprocal interaction, and a technological option with a semi-direct test only allows you to have one-way interaction, non-reciprocal, because it's just a stimulus response. But that distinction has almost gone out of the window now, because you and I are having a face-to-face conversation, but we're doing it via technology. We're not in a physical proximity. We're way remote from one another. And we're also recording it at the same time through the abilities offered by Microsoft Teams. So there's a sort of a blurring going on, with technology enabling multiple interactants to interact in a remote context, in a remote way, and to engage in a variety of task types, which could also embrace integrated skills management. So we could have other skills incorporated within our conversation today, and this would be possible in a testing context as well. So we have this expansion in opportunities, and it's not just in assessment delivery modes, it's also in rating or marking procedures for spoken language assessment. So it's possible to do live or audio or video marking now in real time, or post hoc after an examination using recorded performances. And raters, examiners, can be physically present, or they can be physically and temporarily remote. All sorts of configurations or constellations of conditions are becoming possible. Automatic speech recognition systems are starting to be more effective in measuring certain types of spoken language features. So you can see how technology is allowing the opportunities to be quite exciting and almost endless. The big question for language testers, I think, in assessing spoken language performance is the need to explore what do machine systems do best and what do human raters do best? And how can the two be combined to generate an optimum outcome in terms of meaningful and useful scores? And which types of technological configuration allow us to tap into certain aspects of the construct that we're interested in, whether it's speaking and listening, or interactional competence, or integration of multiple skills. So there's lots in the toolbox, but we need to be wise in what we choose to use for what purpose, with what individuals and in what context. So that's one area where I think, future trends are exciting but also challenging in spoken language assessment. I suppose the other trend that I would observe from a lifetime in language testing to be relevant at the moment is the ever-expanding construct of spoken language proficiency. And if we go back and analyse the history of speaking assessment, as Cyril and I and others have done, and speaking test design, then we realise how our understanding and description of what spoken language proficiency is has steadily evolved and expanded and got bigger and more sophisticated and complex. And the most recent additions to that description, I suppose, are the interactional competence dimension, particularly as it relates to non-linguistic or paralinguistic behavioural elements, such as those we've been talking about. But also, if you look at the most recent work of the Common European Framework project, the companion volume, which came out earlier this year, there's been a hugely enhanced description of linguistic competence, which introduces completely new areas, such as signing competences, but also expansion of previously mentioned areas such as mediation. And, the new scales relating to mediation skills are quite interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see how we learn to work with and apply those in relation to speaking assessment. I think not much has been done yet, but there's a lot of interest, and I think a lot of work will take place over the coming years in that field. The only other thing and this is the point I'd perhaps end on, is the increasing importance of what has come to be known as assessment literacy, as the use and the influence of tests and testing outcomes grows worldwide. And this is something that I and other people have been talking about and writing about for over a decade. And there are lots of people now who are working in this field and doing some exciting research. The reason I think it's important is that it becomes extremely important when tests assume a certain power and influence. It's important that we understand the differing stakeholder groups who are implicated in or affected by such tests. So those people who choose or need to use language proficiency tests, and why they do. And I think as a language testing community, I feel a certain responsibility, to be humble enough to stand in other people's shoes and see where and how assessment fits in their world, and how we who are professional language test designers and developers can best respond to the needs by sharing our expertise and our experience for the common good. I sense a certain danger of, I suppose I'd call it a sense of arrogance on the part of testers sometimes, that we need to educate you in matters of assessment, and I'm very uncomfortable with that, because I think the world that we live in depends on people learning to be relational, having good mediation skills, if you like, and having worked for over 30 years with many different stakeholder groups in many different educational, social and political contexts in many different parts of the world, I realise how important it is that this is a collaborative endeavour. So if you like, this is an exercise, this conversation that we're having is an exercise in mediation. And what I seek to do is to share my expertise as part of the ongoing project of learning about EAP. So hopefully assessment literacy will increasingly be a way of connecting people with different communities of expertise, so that they can share their own professional experience with others. And in terms of me and my experience, I think I've come to see assessment literacy as the privilege of accompanying people on that apprenticeship journey that I did years ago, helping to build competence and confidence in relation to testing and assessment, so that they will be able to do in their context the things they need to do with greater competence and confidence.